flight. And finally, about half a year later, I think on the 7th of July 1943, General Dornberger and I were summoned to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to report about the thing. And we had an opportunity to first show him the film. And at the end of the film, he made an interesting remark. He apologized to General Dornberger for not having believed in him, which is, I think, one of the very rare cases on record where he apologized to anyone. And he then apparently forgot about his infallible dreams quite abruptly, said, we think we have something pretty formidable here, and ordered immediately the highest priority to put this thing into quantity production.
Hitler had ordered mass production, but you weren't ready for this too far. Could you describe that situation?
Well, you see, after the first successful flight in October 1942, we had many more failures. And this bird was still very unreliable and by no means ready for mass production. So under normal, the Allies knew what we were up to, not only that we had a rocket under development, but also that a production plan was laid out in these plans. And this was a direct reason for Hitler ordering the entire production of the E-4 to go underground. And this led to the creation of what became known as the Mittelwerk. Now, the Mittelwerk was originally a subterranean oil depot south of the Harz Mountains, where large quantities of oil were stored. It was a very dry sort of a tunnel, and it was found that this was maybe the facility that could be most readily converted into a V2 assembly plant. The man who was put in charge of developing such a fabrication plant, subterranean fabrication plant out of that oil depot, was given to Himmler's construction superintendent, an SS general by the name of Kammler. And I think Kammler's main qualification to this job consists of the fact that he was also in charge of several concentration camps. So he put his concentration camp inmates to work to dig out these tunnels and so forth. These inmates, by the way, were mainly resistance fighters from France, Yugoslavia, Poland, predominantly, and there were also German communists among them that the Nazis had reeled and so forth. So it was a pretty international mix of people. The working conditions there were absolutely horrible. I saw the Mittelwerk several times, once while these prisoners were blasting new tunnels in there, and was really a pretty hellish environment. I'd never been in a mine before, but it was clearly worse in a mine. Well, after he got this assignment of blasting the tunnels into the Mittelwerk and establish a factory there, I think his appetite was whetted to participate in on the other end of the thing also. He saw the V2 was a coming thing, and being an SS general, he really tried to get control of the entire V2 program, and he envisioned himself to become one fine day the commanding general of this entire V-weapons program. That was really his abiding ambition, and he succeeded later on in doing that. And his qualification to that, of course, was minimal because the man had hardly any military training whatsoever.
What about the rivalry between the military and the SS as far as it affected Peenemünde?
Well, as long as the army was in tight control of Peenemünde, they managed to keep the SS essentially in the periphery, you know, in things like security of the general area, but not even on the premises themselves. They were all army guarded. I think things changed very substantially after the 20th of July 1944, when a number of army officers made this aborted attempt on Hitler's life. The SS clearly saw its fortunes and its opportunity in this thing because the army was, and the top army leadership was in the doghouse, and Hitler entrusted more and more key functions to the SS. And Kammler utilized this opportunity very cleverly to move Dornberger, who had really built up the entire V2 program, including training of the troops and development of the mobile ground equipment and so forth, and moved him into a secondary position as a logistics supply man rather than the commanding general, which Kammler himself wanted to become. And he, of course, could do a thing without Dornberger's help, but Dornberger was absolutely eclipsed by him towards the end, and as a result was not in command of the V2 troops later on when they were employed, but Kammler was.
Could you describe how you first met Himmler?
I remember, if I remember correctly, Himmler once visited us in Peenemünde. He came all by himself, driving his own car, and we learned about the whole visit only a day before. And he spent an evening informing himself about what was going on. And on the next day, I think we launched 2 V2s, one failed miserably, destroyed 3 aircraft of our adjacent Luftwaffe airfield, which caused Himmler to make a remark that we seem to have a very effective close-range weapon here. But on the same afternoon, a successful flight was made, which sort of compensated for the morning disaster. And I think he left the place with the statement that he would put in a good word for our priorities. Well, then later on, when the SS decided to grab this whole thing for himself, and I think Kammler was really the man who was driving Himmler to get a hold of this thing, they tried all sorts of ruses to drive the army out of the control. It began with a directive that Dornberger received one fine day from the SS security people, that Colonel Sanson, who at that time was commanding officer at Peenemünde, reporting to Dornberger, was a security risk and had to be immediately removed. There was absolutely nothing against Kammler, against Sanson, but it was very typical for Dornberger how he solved the problem. Dornberger made himself again a military commander of Peenemünde, and he called Sanson back to become his own deputy. So he put himself in the position of reporting to his own deputy, and the SS couldn't touch a guy who was directly in Berlin, you know, reporting to the Army Supreme Command, because there the power structure was such that the SS couldn't touch it. After this Sanson thing had failed, the vectored in on me. I was the technical director of Peenemünde, and one fine day I was summoned to Himmler's headquarters in East Prussia, and Himmler told me, in essence, well, I hope you realize that this E4 has ceased to be a toy, you know, for your engineers, that the whole German people is waiting for the new weapon of retaliation, you know, the Allied bombings and all that. And I could full well imagine how you poor engineers there are completely encroached by this high-bound army bureaucracy and so forth. And why don't you join us, and we here in the SS will really get this thing going? And you know, I can always see Hitler whenever I have a problem and so forth. And you'll be much better off, you know, reporting to me rather than Dornberger. And I told Kamla essentially that such a change in organizational arrangement at this moment would be downright disastrous to the program, that I couldn't ask for a better boss than General Dornberger, and I didn't think it was a good idea. Whereupon I was dismissed with a sourly smile, and about 3 weeks later I was arrested. And they threw all sorts of silly charges at me. The main point formally was that in some social party in the vicinity of Zinnowitz, after a couple of drinks, I had made the remarks, we never meant to develop our weapons of war, but we wanted to fly to the planets with these rockets, and isn't it a pity that these rockets are now joining the bloody business of war and so forth? And that was considered a defeatist attitude and would reflect on my whole attitude, and I really didn't have the heart in this thing and pushing it as hard as it should and so forth. And they also said that I was holding an airplane in readiness and wanted to fly with all the secret reports to England. You know, it was shortly after the Hess affair. And the truth of the matter was that I had a small single-engine airplane at my disposal at Peenemünde, which I used flying myself as my business trips. And of course I couldn't disprove that I couldn't head in a different direction on fine day. The plane surely had the range, but I couldn't really defend myself. But I was finally gotten out of the jam. I mean, it was really a dangerous situation, I believe, in retrospect. I was gotten out of the jam simply by Dornberger, going all the way up to the top, speaking to people like Field Marshal Keitel, who at that time was commander of the armed forces, all three services, and saw Hitler on a daily basis, and he also talked to Speer and so forth. He convinced these people that if they kept me in a clink, you know, there would be no V4. And so I was finally released with Dornberger virtually personally vouching for my reliability. And so this was the second aborted attempt to read the situation. But then after, this was in March 1944, and then in July 44, after the attempt of the army, of this group of army officers in Hitler's life, Kammler was put in charge of the military operation of the V1 and V2 programs, and Dornberger was pushed into obscurity. So it was really in the wake of the assassination attempt on Hitler that the SS finally won the battle.
You were accused of